The morning sun cast long shadows across the military training ground as Sarah Mitchell adjusted her gear for what felt like the 100th time. Her hands trembled slightly as she checked her rifle, the weight of it both familiar and foreign after months of training. Around her, the other recruits moved with a confidence she envied, their movements precise and purposeful. Sarah felt like an imposter among them, a feeling that had grown stronger with each passing day. "Mitchell, you're up next." Sergeant Rodriguez's voice cut through the crisp morning air like a blade. Sarah's stomach dropped. The combat drill course loomed before her like a monster waiting to devour her confidence once again. She had failed this same course 17 times in the past 2 months. 17 times she had crawled through the mud. 17 times she had missed crucial targets. And 17 times she had watched her dreams of becoming a military police officer crumble a little more. The other recruits stepped back to give her space, but Sarah could feel their eyes on her. Some looked sympathetic, others merely curious about how spectacular her failure would be this time. Jessica Chun, her bunkmate, gave her an encouraging nod, but even Jessica's support couldn't quiet the voice in Sarah's head that whispered she didn't belong here. Sarah approached the starting line, her combat boots feeling heavier with each step. The course stretched out before her, a series of obstacles, targets, and scenarios designed to test every skill she had supposedly learned. There were wooden barriers to climb, targets to hit with precision, and a maze of trenches to navigate while under simulated enemy fire. Other recruits completed it in under 4 minutes. Sarah's best time was 7 minutes and 32 seconds, and that was on a day when she hadn't completely fallen apart. "Remember, Mitchell," Sergeant Rodriguez called out, his voice carrying the weight of authority and barely concealed frustration, speed, and accuracy. "The enemy won't wait for you to get comfortable." The sergeant had been patient with her, more patient than she deserved, but Sarah could see the doubt creeping into his eyes. She was becoming the recruit that instructors whispered about in the mess hall, the one who made them question their teaching methods. Sarah took her position at the starting line, trying to control her breathing like she had been taught. In through the nose, out through the mouth. Focus on the objective, not the fear. But the fear was always there, a constant companion that had followed her from her small hometown in Ohio all the way to this military base in Georgia. It was the same fear she had felt as a child when her father would come home drunk and angry, the same fear that had driven her to seek order and purpose in the military. The whistle blew, sharp and unforgiving. Sarah launched herself forward, her legs pumping as she sprinted toward the first obstacle. The wooden wall stood 8 feet high, scarred from countless recruits who had scaled it before her. Sarah grabbed the rope hanging from the top and pulled herself up, her muscles straining against the weight of her gear. For a moment, she felt strong, capable. Then her foot slipped. She caught herself before falling, but precious seconds had already ticked away. Behind her, she could hear the shuffle of boots as the other recruits shifted impatiently. Some of them would run this course after her, and they were already calculating whether they would have time for lunch before the afternoon training session. Sarah was just another delay in their day. Pulling herself over the wall, Sarah landed hard on the other side, her ankle twisting slightly in the soft dirt. She ignored the pain and pressed forward to the first set of targets. 5 metal silhouettes stood at varying distances, each one representing an enemy combatant. Sarah raised her rifle, trying to remember everything she had been taught about breathing, sight alignment, and trigger control. The first shot went wide, missing the target completely. The second hit the edge of the silhouette, technically a hit, but not a stopping shot. Sarah's heart raced as she adjusted her aim for the third target. The rifle felt unwieldy in her hands, like a tool she had never seen before. Her shots continued to miss or barely graze the targets, each failure adding weight to the crushing certainty that she would never be good enough. By the time she reached the trench navigation section, Sarah was already behind schedule. The trenches were designed to simulate battlefield conditions, complete with mud, water, and the sound of simulated gunfire overhead. Sarah crawled through the first trench, her uniform soaking up the cold, muddy water that pooled at the bottom. The sound of blank ammunition firing above her head was supposed to add stress to the exercise, but Sarah was already drowning in her own anxiety. Halfway through the trench system, Sarah encountered the rope bridge. It stretched 15 feet across a pit filled with muddy water, swaying slightly in the morning breeze. Other recruits crossed it like they were walking on solid ground, but Sarah had fallen from this bridge more times than she could count. Her hands gripped the rough rope, and she began to inch her way across, one agonizing step at a time. The rope bridge swayed under her weight, and Sarah's confidence evaporated. She could feel her muscles tensing up, her movements becoming rigid and uncertain. Halfway across, her foot slipped through the gap between the ropes, and she found herself dangling by her arms over the muddy pit below. The watching recruits fell silent, some looking away in embarrassment for her. With tremendous effort, Sarah managed to pull herself back onto the bridge and continue across, but the damage was done. Her time was already well beyond the acceptable limit, and she still had 3 more sections of the course to complete. Her uniform was now covered in mud from her struggle on the bridge, and her confidence was at an all-time low. The next section required her to army crawl under a series of low obstacles while live rounds were fired overhead at a safe but intimidating height. Sarah dropped to her belly and began the crawl, her rifle dragging through the dirt beside her. The sound of the ammunition was deafening, and even though she knew she was safe, her body responded as if she were in real danger. Her movements became jerky and panicked, and she found herself frozen halfway through the obstacle. For 30 seconds, Sarah lay motionless in the dirt, paralyzed by the combination of stress, exhaustion, and overwhelming self-doubt. She could hear Sergeant Rodriguez calling her name, urging her to move, but her body wouldn't respond. The other recruits watched in silence, some with pity, others with the cold calculation of people who were already writing her off as a failure. Finally, Sarah forced herself to continue, completing the crawling section with the mechanical movements of someone who had given up hope. The final obstacle was a climbing wall followed by a sprint to the finish line, but Sarah's legs felt like lead weights. She hauled herself up the wall with the last of her strength and stumbled toward the finish line, crossing it with a time of 9 minutes and 15 seconds. The training ground fell silent, except for the sound of Sarah's labored breathing. 9 minutes and 15 seconds was not just a failure. It was a spectacular failure that would likely end her military career before it had truly begun. Sarah stood at the finish line, covered in mud and sweat, staring at the ground because she couldn't bear to meet anyone's eyes. Sergeant Rodriguez approached her with a clipboard in hand, his face unreadable. "Mitchell," he said quietly, "we need to talk." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She had heard those words before, from teachers who couldn't reach her, from coaches who had given up on her, from employers who had decided she wasn't worth the effort. They were the words that preceded the end of dreams. As the other recruits began to disperse, heading to lunch or to prepare for their afternoon training, Sarah remained standing at the finish line. Her muddy uniform clung to her body, and she could feel the grit between her teeth from her crawl through the trenches. More than the physical discomfort, though, was the emotional weight of repeated failure pressing down on her shoulders. Sarah thought about the letter she would have to write to her mother, explaining why she was coming home early from military training. She thought about the job she had quit to pursue this dream, the apartment she had given up, the friends who had wished her luck as she left for basic training. All of those bridges burned for a dream that was now crumbling in her muddy hands. The worst part wasn't the failure itself. It was the growing certainty that she simply wasn't cut out for military life. Some people were born warriors, natural leaders who could handle stress and make split-second decisions under pressure. Sarah was beginning to accept that she wasn't one of those people. She was just a small-town girl who had confused desperation for courage, who had mistaken running away from her problems for running toward a solution. As Sarah walked slowly toward the barracks to clean up before her meeting with Sergeant Rodriguez, she tried to prepare herself for the conversation that would end her military career. She would listen politely as he explained that the military wasn't for everyone, that there were other ways to serve her country, that her failure didn't reflect on her worth as a person. They would be kind words wrapped around a harsh truth. She wasn't good enough, and she never would be. The barracks were empty when Sarah arrived, all the other recruits having gone to lunch or to other training activities. Sarah sat on her bunk and stared at her muddy boots, trying to find the strength to face what came next. In a few hours, she would probably be packing her belongings and preparing to return to civilian life, another casualty of military training who simply couldn't measure up to the standards required. But somewhere deep inside, beneath the layers of failure and self-doubt, a small flame of determination still flickered. Sarah couldn't understand why she kept trying, why she kept subjecting herself to the humiliation of repeated failure, but something inside her refused to give up completely. Maybe it was stubbornness, maybe it was stupidity, but Sarah wasn't ready to quit just yet. She looked at her reflection in the small mirror above her bunk and saw a young woman covered in mud and defeat, but still standing. Tomorrow, if they would let her, she would try again. She would fail again, probably, but she would try, because giving up felt like dying, and Sarah Mitchell was determined to keep living, keep fighting, even if she didn't know how to win yet. The afternoon sun streamed through the barracks windows as Sarah prepared to face Sergeant Rodriguez and learn her fate. Little did she know that her biggest challenge and her greatest opportunity was still waiting for her just around the corner. The meeting with Sergeant Rodriguez didn't go as Sarah had expected. Instead of the gentle dismissal she had prepared herself for, she found herself sitting in a small office while the sergeant reviewed her file with a furrowed brow. The walls were covered with military certificates and photographs of successful training classes, a reminder of the standards she was failing to meet. "Mitchell," Sergeant Rodriguez began, closing her file and leaning back in his chair, "your written test scores are among the highest in your class. Your knowledge of military protocol, weapons systems, and tactical theory is exceptional." He paused, studying her face. "But something happens to you out there on the practical exercises. It's like you become a different person." Sarah shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her clean uniform a stark contrast to the muddy mess she had been just an hour earlier. "I know, Sergeant. I freeze up. I can't explain it." Her voice was barely above a whisper, carrying the weight of months of frustration and self-doubt. "The thing is," Rodriguez continued, "I've seen recruits with half their knowledge sail through these courses because they had natural physical instincts. And I've seen brilliant tactical minds wash out because they couldn't handle the pressure. You're presenting me with a puzzle, Mitchell." He leaned forward, his eyes serious but not unkind. "I'm going to give you one more chance, but there's a condition." Sarah's heart leaped, then immediately plummeted as she waited for the catch. In her experience, second chances always came with impossible conditions, ways for authority figures to seem merciful while still ensuring failure. "There's a special training program," Rodriguez explained, led by someone with experience in breaking down psychological barriers in combat situations. "It's unconventional. The instructor doesn't use standard military training methods. Some people think he's crazy, others think he's brilliant. But he has a track record of helping people who seem hopeless." The next morning, Sarah found herself standing in front of a small, nondescript building on the far edge of the training facility. The structure looked more like a warehouse than a training facility, with no identifying marks or military signage. As she approached the door, Sarah's anxiety spiked. The unknown was somehow more terrifying than the familiar pattern of failure she had grown accustomed to. She pushed open the heavy door and stepped into a space unlike any training facility she had seen. The interior was sparse but purposeful, with mats covering most of the floor and various pieces of equipment she didn't recognize scattered around the room. At the far end, a man sat meditating in complete silence, his posture perfect despite the casual way he wore his military fatigues. Commander Jake Morrison was not what Sarah had expected. She had imagined someone loud and intimidating, a stereotypical military hard-ass who would break her down before building her back up. Instead, she saw a man in his 40s with graying temples and laugh lines around his eyes, someone who looked more like a philosophy professor than a Navy SEAL commander. "You must be Mitchell," he said without opening his eyes. His voice was calm, almost gentle, but carried an undercurrent of absolute authority. "I've read your file. 17 failures on the same course. That's actually quite impressive in its own way." Sarah bristled at what felt like mockery. "I'm sorry if my failures are entertaining to you, sir." The words came out sharper than she intended, fueled by months of frustration and the sting of being passed from one instructor to another like a problem that no one wanted to solve. Commander Morrison opened his eyes and looked at her with an expression of mild curiosity rather than offense. "Tell me something, Mitchell. In all those 17 attempts, what were you thinking about when you failed?" The question caught Sarah off guard. No instructor had ever asked her about her thoughts during the exercises. They focused on her technique, her timing, her physical performance, but never on what was happening inside her head. I was thinking about not failing, she admitted reluctantly. About not embarrassing myself. About what everyone was thinking of me. As she spoke the words, Sarah realized how counterproductive that mindset had been, but she had never recognized it consciously before. Exactly, Morrison said, rising from his meditation pose with fluid grace. You've been fighting yourself instead of fighting the course. Every time you stepped up to that starting line, you brought 17 previous failures with you. You were running against ghosts instead of racing against time. Over the next 2 hours, Morrison put Sarah through exercises unlike anything she had experienced in her months of military training. They didn't touch a rifle or climb a single obstacle. Instead, he had her practice breathing techniques while he shouted in her ear, teaching her to maintain focus under stress. He had her close her eyes and navigate the room using only her other senses, building confidence in her ability to handle uncertainty. Most surprisingly, he had her spend 30 minutes talking about her childhood, her fears, and her motivations for joining the military. No instructor had ever cared about her personal history, but Morrison seemed to understand that her past was directly connected to her present struggles. Your father, Morrison said after listening to her story, he made you feel like you had to be perfect to be worthy of love and respect. So now, every time you make a mistake, you're not just failing a drill. You're proving what he made you believe about yourself. The observation hit Sarah like a physical blow, accurate and painful in its simplicity. But that's not who you are, Morrison continued. That's just a story you've been carrying. Today, we're going to start writing a new story. The afternoon session was different from anything Sarah had experienced. Morrison had set up a modified version of the combat course, but instead of timing her or focusing on her performance, he walked alongside her, talking her through each obstacle with a calm, steady voice. Don't think about the last time, he said as they approached the rope bridge that had been the site of so many humiliating falls. This bridge exists right now, in this moment. There is no history here except what you create today. Sarah stepped onto the bridge with Morrison's words echoing in her mind. For the first time in months, she wasn't thinking about her previous failures or the people watching her. She was thinking only about the rope beneath her feet and the other side of the bridge waiting for her. She made it across without falling. The success was small, almost insignificant in the grand scheme of her training, but it felt monumental to Sarah. Morrison didn't celebrate or make a big show of her achievement. He simply nodded and moved on to the next obstacle, treating her success as natural and expected rather than surprising. As they continued through the course, Sarah began to understand what Morrison was teaching her. He wasn't trying to make her stronger or faster or more skilled. He was trying to get her out of her own way, to help her access abilities that had been there all along, but were buried under layers of fear and negative self-talk. The mind is the most powerful weapon you have, Morrison explained as they finished the modified course. But, like any weapon, it can be turned against you if you don't know how to control it. You've been using your mind to defeat yourself before you even started fighting. That evening, Sarah sat in the barracks with a journal Morrison had given her, writing down her thoughts and experiences from the day. It felt strange to be analyzing her mental state instead of cleaning her rifle or studying tactical manuals, but she was beginning to understand that her problems weren't technical. They were psychological. Jessica Chun noticed the change in her bunkmate immediately. You seem different, she observed as they prepared for lights out. More. I don't know, centered somehow. Sarah smiled, the first genuine smile she had managed in weeks. I think I'm starting to understand what's been going wrong, she said. It turns out I've been my own worst enemy this whole time. Over the next few days, Sarah continued working with Morrison, learning techniques that seemed more like psychology than military training. He taught her visualization exercises where she would mentally rehearse successful completion of the course, programming her subconscious mind for success instead of failure. He showed her how to use physical anchors, small gestures or phrases that could help her return to a calm, focused state when stress began to overwhelm her. He explained how her breathing patterns affected her performance and taught her to use controlled breathing as a tool for managing anxiety. Most importantly, he helped her understand the difference between healthy pressure and destructive stress. Pressure is when you care about doing well, he explained. Stress is when you care about not doing badly. One motivates you to excellence. The other paralyzes you with fear. The transformation wasn't immediate or complete. Sarah still struggled with moments of doubt and anxiety, but now she had tools to work with instead of simply enduring the emotional turmoil. Morrison taught her to recognize the early signs of stress and intervene before it became overwhelming. Your body is talking to you all the time, he said during one of their sessions. Most people ignore the conversation until their body starts screaming. Learn to listen to the whispers, and you'll never have to deal with the screams. After a week of working with Morrison, Sarah felt ready to attempt the combat course again. But Morrison had a different idea. Instead of sending her back to the official course where she had failed so many times, he wanted her to complete his modified version under time conditions. We need to build some positive momentum, he explained. Success breeds success, just like failure had been breeding failure for you. You need to experience what it feels like to win before you can win consistently. Sarah completed Morrison's course in 4 minutes and 12 seconds, well within the acceptable range for her training level. It wasn't a perfect run, but it was competent, confident, and, most importantly, successful. As she crossed the finish line, Sarah felt a surge of emotion that caught her by surprise. It wasn't just relief or satisfaction. It was a rediscovery of her own capability. "How do you feel?" Morrison asked, though the answer was written clearly on Sarah's face. "Like myself," she replied, surprising herself with the accuracy of the response. "For the first time in months, I feel like myself." Morrison nodded approvingly. "That's because you stopped trying to be perfect and started trying to be present. Perfection is an impossible standard that guarantees failure. Presence is a skill that guarantees you will perform to the best of your current ability." That night, Sarah wrote extensively in her journal, documenting not just the day's training, but her evolving understanding of herself and her capabilities. She was beginning to see that her problems hadn't been a reflection of her inadequacy, but rather a sign that she had been approaching her challenges from the wrong angle entirely. The week with Morrison had given her more than just new techniques and strategies. It had given her hope, a commodity that had been in increasingly short supply during her months of repeated failure. She was starting to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could succeed not in spite of who she was, but because of who she was. As she prepared for sleep, Sarah felt a calm confidence that had been absent from her life for longer than she cared to remember. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight she rested in the knowledge that she was finally fighting for herself instead of against herself. The real test, she knew, was still coming. But for the first time since arriving at the training facility, Sarah Mitchell felt ready to face it. 2 weeks into her training with Commander Morrison, Sarah faced her most challenging session yet. Morrison had remained largely mysterious about his background, revealing only small pieces of his military experience when it related directly to her training. But today, as he prepared an exercise he called Chaos Integration, Sarah sensed something different in his demeanor. "Today we're going to simulate real combat stress," Morrison announced, his usual calm tone carrying an edge of seriousness that made Sarah's stomach tighten. "Everything you've learned about mental control and present moment awareness will be tested under conditions designed to overwhelm your nervous system." The warehouse had been transformed overnight. Speakers were positioned throughout the space, ready to blast the sounds of gunfire, explosions, and shouting voices. Smoke machines created a hazy atmosphere that limited visibility to just a few feet. Strobe lights flickered unpredictably, creating disorienting flashes that would make navigation difficult. "The course itself is simple," Morrison explained, handing Sarah a modified rifle loaded with blanks. "Navigate from one end of the room to the other, engage 5 targets, and extract through the far exit. But you'll be doing it while your nervous system is convinced you're in actual combat." Sarah gripped the rifle, feeling its familiar weight, but noting how different it felt when she wasn't paralyzed by fear of failure. The weeks of mental training had given her tools, but she had never tested them under truly extreme conditions. "Before we begin," Morrison said, studying her face intently, "I want you to remember something. Your nervous system doesn't know the difference between real danger and simulated danger. Your body will react as if your life depends on your performance, because as far as your brainstem is concerned, it does." As Sarah took her position at the starting point, Morrison moved to the control station where he could monitor her progress and adjust the intensity of the simulation. For a moment, the warehouse fell completely silent, the calm before the storm that would test everything she had learned. "Remember your breathing," Morrison called out. "Remember your anchors. And remember that you belong here." The simulation began with a thunderclap that seemed to shake the building. Immediately, the The sounds of battle filled the air. Rifle fire, shouting voices, the whistle of incoming artillery. The smoke machines activated, filling the space with a thick fog that made Sarah's eyes water and reduced visibility to almost nothing. Sarah's first instinct was to freeze, the overwhelming sensory input triggering every alarm system in her body. Her heart rate spiked. Her breathing became shallow and rapid, and for a moment she felt the familiar paralysis that had plagued her for months. But then she remembered Morrison's training. She focused on her breath, using the 4-count technique he had taught her. 4 counts in, hold for 4, 4 counts out, hold for 4. Within seconds, her breathing stabilized and her heart rate began to slow. The first target appeared through the smoke, a barely visible silhouette that Sarah almost missed entirely. Instead of rushing her shot, she applied Morrison's teachings about present moment awareness. She ignored the chaos around her and focused entirely on sight alignment, breathing control, and trigger squeeze. The shot rang out clean and true, striking the target's center mass. Sarah felt a surge of confidence, but Morrison's voice in her ear reminded her to stay focused. Good hit. Move. Don't celebrate yet. Navigating through the smoke-filled warehouse was like moving through a nightmare. The strobe lights created disorienting flashes that made her question what she was seeing. The sounds of battle were so realistic that Sarah's body was convinced she was in actual danger, flooding her system with adrenaline that threatened to overwhelm her carefully maintained calm. The second target was positioned behind a makeshift barrier, requiring Sarah to move tactically and expose herself minimally while taking the shot. As she moved into position, a new element was added to the simulation: the sound of incoming rounds, complete with the crack of bullets passing nearby. Sarah's training kicked in automatically. Instead of panicking at the sound of gunfire, she used it as information. Morrison had taught her to trust her training and react based on what she knew rather than what she felt. She took cover, assessed the situation, and engaged the target with controlled precision. By the third target, Sarah was moving through the course like a different person than the one who had failed 17 times on the much simpler outdoor course. The chaos that would have paralyzed her weeks earlier now felt manageable, like a storm she could navigate rather than a force that would destroy her. The fourth target presented the greatest challenge yet. It was positioned at the far end of the warehouse, requiring a long-range shot through smoke and intermittent strobe lighting. Sarah took a prone position, using the breathing techniques Morrison had drilled into her to steady her aim despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. The shot was perfect, striking the target dead center despite the challenging conditions. Sarah felt a moment of pure elation, but she immediately refocused on the task at hand. Morrison's voice guided her. Beautiful shot. One more target, then extract. Stay present. The final target was the most psychologically challenging. As Sarah approached it, the sounds of battle intensified dramatically. Explosions seemed to go off just feet away, and the sound of wounded soldiers calling for help added an emotional weight to the simulation that threatened to break her concentration. This was Morrison's final test, Sarah realized. He wasn't just testing her ability to perform under stress. He was testing her ability to maintain focus when her emotions were being deliberately manipulated. The sounds of suffering soldiers triggered every protective instinct she had, making her want to abandon the exercise to help people who weren't really there. Instead of being overwhelmed, Sarah felt a strange sense of clarity. This was exactly what Morrison had been preparing her for: the ability to maintain mission focus even when every instinct screamed at her to do something else. She engaged the final target with the same precision she had shown throughout the exercise. As she reached the extraction point, the simulation ended abruptly. The sounds cut off, the smoke began to clear, and the strobe lights stopped their disorienting flashing. Sarah stood in the sudden quiet, her rifle still at the ready, trying to process what had just happened. Morrison approached her with an expression she had never seen before. It wasn't the calm approval he usually showed, but something deeper. There was respect in his eyes, and something that might have been pride. Time: 3 minutes, 47 seconds, he announced. 5 targets, 5 hits, all center mass. Textbook tactical movement throughout. He paused, studying her face. How do you feel? Sarah took inventory of her physical and emotional state. Her heart was still beating fast from the adrenaline, but she felt controlled, purposeful. I feel capable, she said, the word surprising her with its accuracy. "For the first time since I got here, I feel like I know what I'm doing." "You've always known what you were doing," Morrison corrected gently. "You just had to learn to get out of your own way and let that knowledge work." Over the next hour, Morrison debriefed the exercise with Sarah, helping her understand what had happened and why. He explained how her nervous system had responded to the stress and how her training had allowed her to maintain control despite the chaos. "The mind has two basic modes," he explained: reactive and responsive. Reactive is when you're controlled by your emotions and instincts. Responsive is when you acknowledge the emotions and instincts but choose your actions based on training and judgment. Sarah nodded, understanding the distinction in a way that went beyond intellectual comprehension. She had felt the difference during the exercise, the moment when she stopped reacting to the chaos and started responding to it. "So what happens now?" Sarah asked. She felt different, fundamentally changed by the experience, but she wasn't sure how to integrate this new understanding into her regular training routine. Morrison smiled, the first truly warm expression she had seen from him. "Now you get to find out if you can take what you've learned here and apply it to the real test. Sergeant Rodriguez wants to see you tomorrow morning. He's scheduling you for another attempt at the official combat course." The news should have filled Sarah with anxiety, but instead she felt a calm anticipation. The course that had seemed impossible just weeks earlier now felt like a challenge she was equipped to meet. Not because it had gotten easier, but because she had gotten stronger. That evening, Sarah called her mother for the first time since started her training with Morrison. It was a conversation she had been avoiding, afraid to raise hopes that might be crushed again. But now she felt ready to share her journey. "I think I figured out what was going wrong," she told her mother. "It turns out I was trying so hard not to fail that I forgot to focus on succeeding." Her mother's voice was warm with relief and hope. "You sound different, sweetheart. Stronger somehow." "I feel different," Sarah admitted. "I feel like I remember who I was before I started doubting myself." After the call, Sarah spent time in meditation, a practice Morrison had introduced that initially felt foreign, but had gradually become a source of strength and clarity. As she sat in the quiet of the barracks, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. Months ago, she had been a young woman running from a difficult past, hoping the military would give her structure and purpose. The repeated failures had made her question everything about herself, from her intelligence to her worthiness to exist in the world. Morrison's training had shown her that her problems weren't signs of fundamental inadequacy, but rather evidence that she had been approaching her challenges from the wrong direction. She hadn't needed to become a different person. She had needed to remember who she really was underneath all the fear and self-doubt. As Sarah prepared for sleep, she felt a profound sense of gratitude for the journey she had taken, even the painful parts. The failures that had once seemed like evidence of her unworthiness now felt like necessary steps on the path to understanding herself and her capabilities. Tomorrow would bring the ultimate test, returning to the course where she had failed 17 times and proving to herself and others that she belonged in the military. But tonight, Sarah Mitchell fell asleep with the quiet confidence of someone who had finally learned to fight alongside herself instead of against herself. The young woman who would take the course tomorrow was fundamentally different from the one who had failed so many times before. She carried the same knowledge, the same physical capabilities, but now she also carried something that had been missing, the unshakable belief that she was exactly where she belonged. The morning of Sarah's 18th attempt at the combat course dawned gray and overcast, with a light mist hanging over the training grounds like a shroud. As she made her way to the course, Sarah noticed that word had spread throughout the training facility about her upcoming attempt. More recruits than usual had gathered to watch, some genuinely supportive, others clearly expecting another spectacular failure. Sergeant Rodriguez stood at the starting line with his clipboard, but today he wasn't alone. Commander Morrison had positioned himself at the far end of the course, where he could observe without interfering. His presence was both comforting and nerve-wracking. Sarah knew this was her chance to prove that his unconventional training methods had worked. What Sarah didn't know was that several senior instructors were also watching from a distance. Her repeated failures had become something of a case study at the facility, and there were bets among the staff about whether Morrison's psychological approach would succeed where traditional training had failed. "Mitchell," Sergeant Rodriguez said as she approached, his voice carrying none of the frustrated resignation that had characterized their previous interactions. I want you to know that regardless of what happens today, you've already accomplished something important. The change in your demeanor over the past few weeks has been remarkable. Sarah nodded, appreciating his words, but keeping her focus on the course ahead. The obstacles looked exactly the same as they had 18 previous times, but her relationship to them had fundamentally changed. Where she once saw instruments of humiliation, she now saw challenges to overcome. As she checked her equipment one final time, Sarah caught sight of Jessica Chun in the crowd of observers. Her bunkmate gave her a thumbs up and mouthed, "You got this," a simple gesture that filled Sarah with warmth. It occurred to her that she had spent so much time focused on the people who doubted her that she had forgotten about those who believed in her. Remember what we talked about? Morrison called from his position at the far end of the course. His voice carried clearly across the training ground, and Sarah could hear the quiet confidence in his tone. This moment is the only moment that matters. Sarah took her position at the starting line, feeling the familiar weight of her gear and the texture of the rifle grip in her hands. But instead of the crushing anxiety that had characterized her previous attempts, she felt a calm alertness, like a predator preparing to hunt. The whistle blew, sharp and clear in the misty morning air. Sarah exploded forward with a fluidity that surprised even her. Her legs pumped with purpose rather than desperation, carrying her toward the first obstacle with confidence instead of dread. The 8-foot wall loomed ahead, the same barrier that had been the site of so many fumbling, panicked attempts to climb. This time, Sarah approached it with tactical thinking rather than raw determination. She used her momentum to leap higher than before, grabbed the rope with sure hands, and pulled herself over the top with an efficiency that drew murmurs from the watching crowd. Landing on the other side, Sarah felt the first stirring of something she hadn't experienced in months: the joy of physical competence. Her body was responding exactly as she had trained it to, moving with the precision and purpose she had always possessed, but had buried under layers of anxiety and self-doubt. The target range was next, 5 metal silhouettes, standing at various distances like silent challengers waiting to expose her inadequacy. Sarah approached the firing line with Morrison's voice echoing in her mind. The target is just an object. It has no opinion of you, no judgment to make. It simply exists to be hit. She raised her rifle, settled into her stance, and felt the world narrow to just herself and the first target. Her breathing fell into the rhythm Morrison had taught her, steady and controlled. The rifle felt like an extension of her body rather than an unwieldy tool she was struggling to master. The first shot rang out clean and true, striking the target's center mass. The second followed immediately after, and then the third. Sarah moved through the sequence of targets with a precision that even she found surprising, each shot placed exactly where she intended it to go. From the crowd of observers, she could hear surprised murmurs. Some of the recruits who had watched her fail repeatedly were seeing a completely different person than the one they remembered. Even Sergeant Rodriguez was staring at his stopwatch with an expression of disbelief. Sarah reached the trench navigation section feeling strong and confident. The muddy trenches that had once seemed like a nightmare maze now looked like exactly what they were: a series of obstacles to be navigated efficiently. She dropped into the first trench and began moving forward with purpose rather than panic. The water was cold and the mud was thick, but Sarah's movements were deliberate and economical. She kept her rifle clean and dry while navigating through the tight spaces, a feat of coordination that had eluded her in previous attempts. Morrison's training in present moment awareness kept her focused on each movement rather than worrying about what came next. Halfway through the trench system, Sarah reached the rope bridge that had been the scene of so many humiliating falls. The 15-foot span stretched across the muddy pit, swaying slightly in the morning breeze. In her previous attempts, this bridge had loomed like an instrument of torture designed specifically to expose her inadequacy. Today, it was simply a bridge to cross. Sarah stepped onto the rope with the same calm confidence she had brought to every other obstacle. Her movements were fluid and controlled, her balance perfect as she made her way across the span that had defeated her so many times before. She didn't look down at the muddy water below or forward to the watching crowd. She simply moved from rope to rope, step by step, until she reached the other side. The Army crawl section lay ahead, 100 feet of low obstacles with live ammunition firing overhead at a safe but intimidating height. In previous attempts, The sound of the gunfire had triggered Sarah's flight response, causing her to freeze or move erratically. Today, she used Morrison's techniques to reframe the sound as information rather than threat. Sarah dropped to her belly and began to crawl with smooth, efficient movements. The sound of ammunition passing overhead was still loud and intimidating, but instead of paralyzing her, it focused her attention on the task at hand. She moved through the obstacles like water flowing around stones, each movement purposeful and controlled. Emerging from a crawl, Sarah felt a surge of elation that she immediately channeled into focus for the final obstacles. The climbing wall stood 20 feet high, requiring both strength and technique to scale efficiently. In her previous attempts, exhaustion and demoralization had made the climb feel impossible. Today, Sarah approached the wall with energy reserves intact and confidence high. She found her handholds and footholds with ease, pulling herself up with smooth, controlled movements. At the top, she paused for just a moment to look back at the course she had conquered, then dropped down the other side and sprinted toward the finish line. The final sprint felt like flying. Sarah's legs carried her forward with power and grace, eating up the distance between her and the finish line where Sergeant Rodriguez waited with his stopwatch. She could hear the crowd behind her, their surprised cheers mixing with the sound of her own controlled breathing. Sarah crossed the finish line and immediately looked at Sergeant Rodriguez's stopwatch. 3 minutes, 52 seconds. Not only had she passed, but she had posted a time that was well within the acceptable range for her training level. The training ground erupted in cheers, but the sound seemed to come from far away as Sarah processed what had just happened. After 18 attempts, after months of failure and self-doubt, after coming within days of washing out of the military entirely, she had not just passed the course but excelled on it. Commander Morrison approached from the far end of the course, his expression showing the first genuine smile Sarah had ever seen from him. "Outstanding performance, Mitchell," he said, his voice carrying genuine pride. "But more importantly, how do you feel about what just happened?" Sarah took inventory of her physical and emotional state. She was breathing hard from the exertion, but she felt strong, capable, and profoundly grateful. "I feel like I remembered who I was," she said, the words coming from somewhere deep and honest within her. Sergeant Rodriguez joined them, shaking his head in amazement as he looked at his stopwatch. "Mitchell, that wasn't just a passing performance. That was one of the better times posted by your entire training class. What changed?" Before Sarah could answer, Morrison spoke up. "She stopped fighting against herself and started fighting for herself," he said simply. "All the capability was always there. She just needed to learn how to access it." As the crowd of observers began to disperse, many of the other recruits stopped to congratulate Sarah on her performance. Jessica Chun was practically bouncing with excitement, and even some of the recruits who had written Sarah off as hopeless offered genuine congratulations. But the most meaningful moment came when a young recruit named Tommy Chun, who had been struggling with his own confidence issues, approached Sarah with hesitation. "How did you do it?" he asked quietly. "How did you go from failing every time to succeeding like that?" Sarah looked at the young man and saw her own struggles reflected in his eyes. "I learned that my biggest enemy wasn't the course," she said. "It was the voice in my head that told me I couldn't do it. Once I learned to quiet that voice and listen to my training instead, everything changed." Later that evening, Sarah sat in the barracks writing in the journal Morrison had given her, documenting not just the day's success, but the journey that had led to it. She wrote about the failures that had seemed so devastating at the time, but now looked like necessary steps toward understanding herself and her capabilities. She wrote about Morrison's unorthodox training methods and how they had addressed the real source of her problems rather than just the symptoms. She wrote about the moment during the course when she had felt completely present and capable when all the mental noise had fallen away and she had simply performed. Most importantly, she wrote about the realization that her worth as a person and as a soldier wasn't dependent on never failing, but on how she responded to failure. The 18 attempts at the course hadn't been 18 failures. They had been 18 learning opportunities that had ultimately led to success. As Sarah prepared for sleep that night, she felt a profound sense of peace and accomplishment. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to apply what she had learned, but tonight she rested in the knowledge that she had proven something important to herself and others. She had proven that determination combined with the right training and mindset could overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles. She had proven that failure wasn't permanent and that personal growth was possible at any stage of life. Most importantly, she had proven to herself that she belonged exactly where she was. The young woman who fell asleep in the barracks that night was fundamentally different from the one who had arrived months earlier. She carried the same dreams and aspirations, but now she also carried the unshakable knowledge that she had what it took to achieve them. Sarah Mitchell had finally learned to fight for herself instead of against herself, and that had made all the difference in the world. 3 months after her breakthrough performance on the combat course, Sarah Mitchell stood in Commander Morrison's office, but this time the circumstances were completely different. Instead of being the struggling recruit who needed psychological intervention, she was now one of the top performers in her training class and had been selected for advanced leadership development. "Sit down, Mitchell," Morrison said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. The sparse office hadn't changed much, but Sarah's relationship to it had transformed completely. Where she had once sat in desperation and defeat, she now sat with quiet confidence and curiosity about what new challenge awaited her. Morrison studied her for a moment before speaking. "Your performance over the past 3 months has been exceptional," he began. "Top of your class in tactical exercises, leadership scores in the 95th percentile, and you've become an informal mentor to struggling recruits. Sergeant Rodriguez tells me you've helped 3 other soldiers overcome their own performance barriers." Sarah felt a warm glow of pride at the recognition, but more than that, she felt grateful for the opportunity to help others avoid the months of struggle she had endured. "Thank you, sir. It feels good to be able to give back some of what you gave me. That's actually why you're here," Morrison continued. "I'm being transferred to a new assignment, developing psychological resilience training programs for special operations candidates. I recommended you for early graduation and immediate assignment to my new unit." The news hit Sarah like a thunderbolt. Early graduation meant she would complete her training ahead of schedule and move directly into advanced special operations preparation, a track that was typically reserved for the most elite candidates. "Sir, I'm honored by the recommendation," Sarah said, her mind racing with the implications. "But I have to ask why you think I'm ready for something like that." Morrison leaned back in his chair, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Because you've done something that most people never do. You've faced your deepest fears and limitations, acknowledged them honestly, and developed the tools to overcome them. That kind of psychological resilience is exactly what special operations demands." Over the next hour, Morrison explained the nature of his new assignment and what Sarah's role would be. She would be part of a team developing training protocols that addressed the mental and emotional challenges faced by elite military units. Her experience overcoming her own psychological barriers made her uniquely qualified to help others do the same. "The military has always been good at physical training," Morrison explained. "We can make people stronger, faster, and more skilled. But we've been less successful at preparing people psychologically for the unique stresses of combat and special operations. Your journey from failure to success provides a roadmap for others facing similar challenges." As Sarah listened, she realized that her months of struggle and eventual breakthrough had prepared her for something much larger than she had originally imagined. She had joined the military seeking structure and purpose, but now she was being offered the opportunity to help transform how the military approached mental resilience training. "There's something else," Morrison continued, his expression becoming more serious. "The 2 words I mentioned in your recommendation letter, the ones that changed everything for you. Do you remember what they were?" Sarah thought back to her darkest moments on the training course, when she had been ready to give up entirely. She remembered Morrison's calm presence and his simple, powerful intervention that had shifted her entire perspective. "Trust yourself," she said quietly. "You told me to trust myself." Morrison nodded slowly. Those 2 words represent the foundation of all psychological resilience. Not trust your training, not trust your equipment, not trust your instructors. Trust yourself. Because when everything else fails, when you're alone and facing the impossible, the only resource you can absolutely count on is your own inner strength and capability. The conversation continued for another 30 minutes, covering the details of the transfer and the timeline for her new assignment. Sarah would finish her current training cycle and then immediately begin advanced preparation for her new role. It was an opportunity that would have been unimaginable just months earlier. As she prepared to leave Morrison's office, Sarah felt compelled to express something that had been building in her heart for weeks. "Sir, I need to thank you for not giving up on me when I had given up on myself. You saw something in me that I couldn't see, and you gave me the tools to find it." Morrison stood and extended his hand for a firm shake. "I didn't give you anything you didn't already have, Mitchell. I just helped you remember how to use it. The courage, the capability, the resilience, that was all yours from the beginning." That evening, Sarah called her mother to share the news of her upcoming assignment. It was a conversation filled with joy and pride, but also with reflection on how far she had come from the scared young woman who had left home seeking direction and purpose. "I'm so proud of you, sweetheart," her mother said, her voice thick with emotion. "But I'm not surprised. I always knew you had it in you to do something special." After the call, Sarah found herself walking around the base, visiting the places that had been significant in her journey. She stopped at the combat course where she had failed 17 times and succeeded once, understanding now that each failure had been a necessary part of her growth. She visited the small warehouse where Morrison had conducted his unconventional training, remembering the moment when she had first completed the modified course, and felt a return of her confidence. She walked through the barracks where she had spent so many nights doubting herself, and writing in her journal about her struggles and eventual breakthroughs. At each location, Sarah felt a deep sense of gratitude for the journey she had taken. The struggles that had once felt like evidence of her inadequacy now looked like the forge in which her character had been tempered and strengthened. A week later, Sarah's training class held their graduation ceremony. She stood among her fellow recruits, all of whom had overcome their own challenges and obstacles to reach this moment. As she looked out at the proud families and friends who had gathered to celebrate, Sarah spotted Morrison in the crowd, his presence a reminder of how far she had come. During the ceremony, Sergeant Rodriguez called Sarah forward to receive a special recognition for leadership and resilience. As she stood before her classmates and their families, Sarah felt the weight of responsibility that came with her new understanding of herself and her capabilities. "This recognition isn't just for academic or physical performance," Rodriguez announced to the crowd. "It's for demonstrating that persistence, courage, and the willingness to face our deepest challenges can transform not just our own lives, but the lives of those around us." After the ceremony, Sarah was approached by several family members of her fellow recruits, thanking her for the help and encouragement she had provided to their loved ones. She was particularly moved by Tommy Chin's parents, who explained how their son had overcome his own confidence issues with Sarah's mentorship. "You gave him hope when he was ready to quit," Tommy's mother said, tears in her eyes. "You showed him that failure wasn't the end of the story." As the celebration continued around her, Sarah reflected on the circular nature of her journey. She had begun as someone seeking help and had evolved into someone capable of providing help to others. The struggles that had once isolated her had become the foundation for connecting with and supporting others facing similar challenges. Morrison approached her as the crowd began to thin. "Ready for your next adventure?" he asked, his tone carrying both challenge and confidence. Sarah looked around at the training facility that had been her home for the past year, remembering both the struggles and the triumphs it had witnessed. She thought about the young woman who had arrived here desperate for structure and purpose, and the confident leader she had become through perseverance and proper guidance. "Yes, sir," she replied with quiet certainty. "I'm ready." As they walked together toward the parking area, Morrison offered one final piece of wisdom. "Remember, Mitchell, your greatest strength isn't that you never fail. It's that you've learned how to fail forward, how to use setbacks as setups for comebacks. That's a rare quality, and it will serve you well in everything you do." 6 months later, Staff Sergeant Sarah Mitchell stood before a new group of struggling military candidates, preparing to teach the psychological resilience techniques that had transformed her own life. Among the faces looking back at her, she saw the same fear, doubt, and determination that had once characterized her own expression. "My name is Staff Sergeant Mitchell," she began, her voice carrying the authority that came from hard-won experience. "I'm here to teach you about mental resilience and overcoming psychological barriers to performance. Before we begin, I want you to know that I understand exactly what many of you are going through." She paused, looking into the eyes of each candidate. 3 years ago, I failed the same combat course 17 times in a row. I was told by multiple instructors that I didn't have what it takes to succeed in the military. I was days away from washing out when a Navy SEAL commander taught me 2 words that changed everything. The room was completely silent, every candidate hanging on her words. Trust yourself, Sarah continued. Those 2 words contain the key to unlocking capabilities you already possess, but may have forgotten how to access. Over the next few weeks, I'm going to teach you the same techniques that help me transform repeated failure into consistent success. As Sarah began her first official training session, she felt the profound satisfaction that comes from turning personal struggle into purpose. Her journey from failure to success had prepared her not just to overcome her own challenges, but to help others overcome theirs as well. The young woman who had once doubted her place in the world had found not just her place, but her calling. And in helping others discover their own resilience and capability, Sarah Mitchell had discovered the true meaning of service and the power of transformation that comes from refusing to give up on yourself or others. The cycle was complete, but also just beginning. Each new group of candidates would bring fresh challenges and opportunities to apply the lessons she had learned through her own struggle and triumph. And with each person, she helped find their way from fear to confidence. Sarah honored both her own journey and the patient guidance of the man who had refused to let her fail. In the end, Sarah's story wasn't just about overcoming failure or achieving military success. It was about discovering that our greatest struggles often prepare us for our most important contributions, and that the journey from victim to victor to teacher is one of the most meaningful paths a person can walk. The 2 words that had changed everything for Sarah were now changing everything for others, creating ripples of transformation that would extend far beyond anything she had originally imagined possible. Trust yourself. Simple words that contain the power to unlock human potential and transform lives, one struggling candidate at a time.